600,000 people pass away yearly from a disease we cured 400 years ago. The cure is in your gin and tonic right now, diluted to uselessness because pharmaceutical companies spent 70 years making sure you forgot. The fever tree, that glowing molecule is called quinine. Its source is a tree that grows where most plants cannot survive. It lives between 5,000 and 9,000 feet in the Andes of Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, where temperatures swing wildly between day and night, and where cloud cover creates constant humidity but prevents frost. This isn't a tree you stumble across in a garden center. It thrives in conditions that would stop nearly everything else. Cinchona officinalis, the fever tree. The bark looks unremarkable. Rough, grayish-brown. Easy to overlook if you didn't know what you were looking for. But inside that bark sits one of the most powerful compounds nature ever produced. A chemical defense the tree developed to survive its harsh mountain environment, turned by accident into humanity's weapon against one of its oldest threats. For centuries, this tree existed in isolation, known only to the people who lived in its shadow. It didn't ask to become the center of empires. It didn't volunteer to fuel colonial expansion or save millions of lives. It simply grew, year after year, in the thin air and perpetual mist of the high Andes. Today, parts of Hawaii and Northern California could grow this tree. The climate is right, the elevation matches, but nobody does. And 600,000 people pass away every year because of it. But once the rest of the world discovered what it could do, 3 nations tried to keep it secret. They failed. The mountain people's cold remedy. The Quechua people of the Andes used the bark for centuries, though not for malaria. They chewed it to stop shivering during bitter mountain nights. The bark's intense bitterness generated body heat, warming them from the inside out when temperatures plunged after sunset. It was a cold remedy, nothing more. A way to survive the harsh climate of their homeland. They had no idea what else it could do. When Europeans arrived in the 1500s, they brought something the Andes had never seen, Plasmodium falciparum, the most severe strain of malaria. A microscopic parasite that would go on to claim more human lives than any war in history. The Quechua didn't suffer from malaria. Their mountains were too cold for the mosquitoes that carried it. But the Europeans who stumbled into their villages, feverish and near collapse, were desperate for anything that might help. Someone offered them the bark, the same bitter remedy used for shivering. It worked, not because anyone understood why, not because the Quechua had developed it as a cure for tropical disease. It was pure accident. A cold remedy that happened to eliminate parasites no one in the Andes even knew existed. That accident still works 400 years later. The synthetic medications we replaced it with, they stopped working in 12 years. The irony is almost cruel. Indigenous people had been sitting on the cure to one of humanity's greatest threats for generations, and they only discovered it because strangers arrived carrying the disease. Within decades, that accidental discovery would reshape the entire world. When Rome's cardinals started dropping, by the 1630s, malaria was turning Rome into a catastrophe, claiming popes and cardinals alike. The disease didn't care about wealth or power or religious authority. It swept through the Vatican just as easily as it ravaged the poorest neighborhoods. Fever, chills, delirium, fatalities. The pattern repeated endlessly, and no one had an answer. Jesuit missionaries in Peru noticed something extraordinary. The Quechua remedy for shivering was curing European fevers. They didn't understand the mechanism, they just knew it worked. When the bark arrived in Rome in 1631, physicians ground it into powder, mixed it with wine, and watched something that had never happened before. The fevers broke. For the first time in human history, people were recovering from malaria. For 200 years, no one knew why. They couldn't see the parasites in the blood. They didn't understand how the compound worked. They simply observed that grinding this bitter bark and swallowing it down somehow stopped people from succumbing. It was medicine without understanding, pure empirical observation. Take the powder, survive. Skip the powder, succumb. Doctors began prescribing it across Europe. Demand grew. The bark became known as Jesuits' bark, and later, Peruvian bark. Apothecaries stocked it alongside their other remedies, never quite grasping that they were selling the key to unlocking an entire world that had been closed to Europeans for millennia. That powder still works today, but you can't buy it anymore. Not because it stopped working, because nobody profits from it. The white powder that opened continents. Then, in 1820, French chemists isolated the active compound. They called it quinine. Suddenly, the tropics became conquerable. Before quinine, Africa was called the white man's grave. European mortality rates in West Africa exceeded 50% annually. Half of every expedition gone within a year. Malaria didn't just claim soldiers and traders. It ended the very idea that Europeans could establish permanent presence in tropical regions. Quinine changed the equation. By 1850, 50% of Europeans had been perishing in their first year. With quinine, 86% survived. This wasn't just medicine. This was geopolitical power. One molecule rewrote the map of the world. Territories that had been unreachable became accessible. Populations that had been protected by disease suddenly found themselves vulnerable to foreign armies that could now survive long enough to conquer. The white powder didn't cure malaria permanently. It suppressed it. Soldiers took daily doses, keeping the parasites at bay just long enough to march deeper into jungles, establish outposts, and claim land that had resisted European invasion for centuries. Chemists could finally produce quinine in consistent doses, measure its potency, and manufacture it at scale. No more grinding bark and guessing. No more variations in strength that left some batches useless and others toxic. This molecule would save millions, but it would also teach the world a dangerous lesson, that nature's cures could be controlled, owned, and eventually replaced. The fever tree's secret had been extracted, purified, and turned into the key that unlocked continents, and empires would harm people to make copies of that key. The empire builder's secret weapon. The British Empire used quinine to colonize India. The Dutch used it to control Indonesia. The French used it across North Africa. Without quinine, tropical colonies were catastrophic endeavors. Soldiers and administrators arrived with grand plans and perished before they could implement them. Trading posts failed. Military campaigns collapsed. The heat and mosquitoes won every time. With quinine, those same soldiers survived long enough to build forts, establish supply lines, and enforce control over populations that had previously been shielded by disease. It wasn't weapons or superior tactics that determined which European power conquered which territory. It was access to a compound extracted from tree bark growing in the Andes, thousands of miles away from the battles it enabled. The molecule that determined which armies survived jungle warfare wasn't developed in a laboratory. It was taken from indigenous knowledge, refined by European chemists, and deployed as a weapon of expansion. Quinine didn't make colonization morally defensible. It just made it physically possible. British officers in India took their doses daily. Dutch administrators in Java did the same. French troops marching through Algeria carried it in their packs. The same bitter powder, the same routine, the same result. Suppressed fevers, suppressed resistance, suppressed entire nations. History books talk about military strategy and political maneuvering, but they rarely mention the chemical foundation that made it all possible. One tree, one compound. The difference between empire and retreat. If you're realizing right now that everything you learned about history left out the most important parts, you need to subscribe. This channel exists to uncover the truths hiding in plain sight. The molecules, the plants, the forgotten people whose discoveries changed everything. Subscribe now, because next week's episode reveals another natural compound that pharmaceutical companies buried for profit. You won't find this anywhere else. Why your cocktail used to be medicine. And that gin and tonic you order at the bar, that isn't a cocktail invention. That is how British colonial officers in India took their mandatory daily medicine starting in 1825. 2 ounces of gin to mask the bitterness, quinine to keep them alive. It wasn't a social drink. It wasn't something you ordered because you enjoyed the taste. It was survival, dressed up just enough to make the daily routine bearable. Officers received quinine rations. The powder was bitter beyond description, the kind of taste that made you gag if you took it straight. Someone figured out that mixing it with carbonated water helped a little. Adding gin helped even more. The pharmaceutical industry was watching, and they were learning that whoever controlled the cure controlled the money. By the late 1800s, quinine was the most fought-over resource on Earth. Every single gram came from South America's diminishing forests. Demand exploded as European powers raced to claim territory across Africa and Asia, and every expedition needed quinine to survive. The drink became ritual. Officers gathered at sunset. mixed their doses with gin and tonic water, and toasted to another day of not succumbing to malaria. What started as medicine became tradition. Tradition became culture. And culture eventually forgot why the drink existed in the first place. Today, you order a gin and tonic because it tastes refreshing, because it's classic, because everyone else does. The medicine got stripped out decades ago, leaving just enough bitterness to remind you of something you never knew was there. By the late 1800s, every gram came from South America, and South America decided to fight back. The seeds nations would fight for Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, understood what they controlled. They banned the export of seeds. Violators faced severe consequences. This wasn't paranoia. This was survival. These nations knew that whoever controlled cinchona controlled global power. As long as the trees only grew in South America, they held leverage over every European empire desperate for quinine. But European powers couldn't build colonial expansion on a supply chain they didn't own. They needed their own trees, their own plantations, their own supply that couldn't be cut off by South American governments who finally realized what they were sitting on. So they sent thieves, disguised as botanists, disguised as explorers, disguised as scientists on peaceful research missions. Most failed, seeds rotted during the long voyage across the Atlantic. Saplings perished in transit or wilted in climates that couldn't replicate the Andes. The trees were far more finicky than anyone anticipated. The British sent multiple expeditions in the 1860s. They managed to smuggle seeds back to India and attempted to establish plantations. When chemists finally tested the bark from these trees, they found less than 3% quinine. Worthless. Years of effort, fortunes spent, diplomatic incidents, all for trees that produced almost none of the compound that made them valuable in the first place. The desperation grew. Empires were expanding faster than their quinine supply could keep up. Soldiers were succumbing, colonies were failing, and somewhere in the Andes, the right seeds were waiting for someone bold enough or reckless enough to find them. But one man would succeed, and his success would cost him everything. The guide who found the super tree. Then came Charles Ledger. Ledger was a British trader living in Bolivia. He didn't know the forests, but he knew a man who did. Manuel Incra Mamani. Mamani was a local guide who could identify 29 different cinchona varieties by sight. He knew which trees grew at which elevations, which bark held the most medicine, which forests had been stripped bare by collectors desperate to meet European demand. In 1865, he found something extraordinary, a tree in the mountains of Bolivia unlike any other. When its bark was tested, it contained 13% quinine, 3 times the concentration of any known variety, 3 times more valuable than anything the British had managed to smuggle out. This wasn't just a good tree, this was the tree empires had been searching for. Mamani collected 14 pounds of seeds, enough to plant thousands of trees, enough to break South America's monopoly forever. Ledger tried to sell them to the British government. They refused. They had already wasted fortunes on failed expeditions and worthless seeds. They weren't interested in gambling on another unproven claim, so Ledger sold them to the Dutch for 100 pounds. The Dutch didn't hesitate. They understood what they were buying. Not just seeds, but the future of quinine production. The key to controlling the supply that kept soldiers alive and empires expanding. Mamani collected 14 pounds of seeds. Ledger sold them for 100 pounds, and Mamani would lose his life in a prison cell for it. The man who passed away for helping strangers. Mamani tried to collect more. In 1871, Bolivian authorities caught him. They subjected him to severe mistreatment until his ribs cracked, threw him into a cell with no light, no water, no trial. He passed away there, alone, while the seeds he'd collected sailed to Java. His offense was helping Europeans take Bolivia's greatest natural resource. The seeds he'd collected weren't just seeds. They were the foundation of his country's economic power, the leverage that kept South American nations relevant in global trade negotiations. And he'd handed them to foreigners for money. Mamani lost his life for those seeds, not in some heroic last stand, but alone, in a prison cell, punished by his own government for a betrayal they couldn't forgive. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't trying to destroy his homeland. He was a guide doing what guides do, showing outsiders where to find what they were looking for. He probably didn't fully understand that those 14 pounds of seeds would reshape global power. that they'd enable the very colonial expansion that would devastate indigenous communities across the tropics. But understanding doesn't change outcomes. Bolivia lost its monopoly because one man knew the mountains too well and trusted the wrong people. His name should be in history books next to the explorers and scientists who get credited with quinine's story. Instead, he's a footnote, a casualty of botanical theft that nations prefer not to talk about. The Dutch took his seeds to Java, and what they built there would make Bolivia's worst fears come true. Manuel Incra Mamani. Say his name in the comments right now. History erased him, but we don't have to. Drop his name below and tell me, how many other people do you think were erased from history because their discoveries were too valuable to credit them for? Mamani passed away in a cell for knowledge that saved millions. The least we can do is remember his name, the plantation that became a cartel. The Dutch took Mamani's stolen seeds to Java. They planted 17,000 hectares. By 1918, they didn't just have a plantation, they had a cartel. They called it the Quinine Bureau. The bureau set global prices, controlled supply, forced competitors out of business. Any nation that wanted quinine had to go through the Dutch, pay their prices, and accept their terms. British India tried to compete with their own plantations. The trees grew, but the quinine content stayed too low. They couldn't match Java's output or quality. The French tried in Algeria, same result. Decent trees, weak bark, not enough quinine to matter. By 1939, 97% of the world's quinine came from one place, Java. It was a natural monopoly that seemed unbreakable. The Dutch had the best seeds, the best growing conditions, and decades of expertise refining cultivation techniques. They'd figured out how to extract maximum quinine from every harvest, how to process it efficiently, how to flood the market when competitors emerged and strangle them with lower prices. Every European empire, every military force operating in tropical regions depended entirely on Dutch supply. The tree that once grew wild in the Andes now existed almost exclusively on Dutch-controlled plantations halfway around the world. It was the most profitable natural monopoly in history, and it would have lasted decades longer if the world hadn't gone to war, again. When Japan cut the world's medicine supply, and then came World War II. In 1942, Japan invaded Java. Within weeks, the Allies lost access to quinine. Not some of it, all of it, 97% of global supply, gone overnight. American soldiers fighting in the Pacific began succumbing faster to malaria than to combat. Entire units were rendered useless, not by enemy fire, but by mosquitoes. Troops who survived beach landings and jungle warfare collapsed from fevers days later. Soldiers in field hospitals watched their own men burn with fever, knowing the cure existed, but was now sitting on enemy soil. The crisis exposed a strategic disaster nobody had prepared for. Building an empire on a natural monopoly concentrated in one geographic location was reckless. Trusting that supply to remain secure during global conflict was worse. This was the moment the pharmaceutical industry had been waiting for. A crisis big enough to justify abandoning nature entirely. Military planners scrambled. They couldn't win a war in the tropics without malaria protection. They couldn't reclaim Java without troops healthy enough to fight for it. And they couldn't wait for the war to end and hope the plantations would still be standing. The pharmaceutical industry faced an impossible mandate. Find a solution that didn't depend on trees growing on enemy-controlled territory. Find it fast, and make sure it could be manufactured at the scale needed to protect millions of soldiers. Scientists had been attempting to synthesize quinine in laboratories for decades. The molecule was too complex, the process too difficult, the results too inconsistent. But war changes priorities, and what seemed impossible in peacetime suddenly became urgent enough to solve. The question was whether they could do it before malaria claimed more Allied soldiers than Japan ever would. The lab-made miracle. That wasn't scientists had been trying to synthesize quinine for decades. It was too complex. But in 1934, German scientists at Bayer synthesized a related compound called chloroquine. It was cheaper than quinine, easier to manufacture, and initially, it worked. By 1947, chloroquine replaced nature. The pharmaceutical industry won. No more dependence on plantations, no more waiting years for trees to mature, just chemistry, factories, and patents. But here's the part they don't advertise. Chloroquine worked for 12 years. The next medication worked for 5, the next, 1. Chloroquine resistance began in 1957, just 12 years after it was introduced. By the 1960s, resistant strains had spread across the globe. The miracle medication stopped working, so they introduced mefloquine. Resistance appeared in 5 years. Then, atovaquone. Resistance appeared the same year it was released. Every synthetic anti-malarial followed the same pattern. Rapid success followed by total failure. The pharmaceutical industry kept responding the same way. Develop a new medication. Patent it. Charge premium prices during its brief window of effectiveness. Watch resistance emerge. Repeat. Each cycle bought another decade before the parasites adapted. Each cycle generated billions in profits. And each cycle left the same natural compound sitting in the background, ignored. That tonic water behind every bar in the world contains the one compound that never developed widespread resistance. 400 years of continuous use, and the malaria parasite still responds to quinine treatment. But by the time anyone noticed, the infrastructure to produce it had been dismantled, and nobody seemed interested in bringing it back. The medicine they stopped making, and that tonic water sitting behind every bar in the world, it contains the one compound that never developed widespread resistance. Despite 400 years of continuous use, the malaria parasite still responds to quinine treatment. Studies from the 1920s and 30s showed that crude cinchona bark extract was equally or more effective than purified quinine against medication-resistant strains. The real gin and tonic, the version with 1,000 milligrams of quinine, never stopped working. While synthetic medications failed one after another, the natural compound kept eliminating parasites. But the global production infrastructure has collapsed. Java's plantations are gone. The Andean forests have been stripped bare. The knowledge of how to cultivate cinchona at scale was quietly abandoned after World War II. The pharmaceutical market for anti-malarials is worth $4 billion annually, dominated by artemisinin-based therapies. And resistance to those is already emerging in Rwanda and Uganda. The pattern repeats. Another synthetic. Another brief window of success. Another inevitable failure. Here's the cruelest part. Cinchona isn't difficult to grow. It just can't be patented. The tree needs cool temperatures between 50 and 70 degrees, high humidity, no frost. It thrives between 5,000 and 9,000 feet elevation on mountain slopes. Anyone with the right land can grow it. That's exactly why it disappeared. Patent protection for synthetic medications creates monopoly pricing and high profit margins. Natural compounds belong to whoever plants them. The compound in your weekend cocktail still eliminates parasites after 4 centuries. They just stopped making it. The truth they buried in your cocktail. The next time you order a gin and tonic, taste that bitterness. That's not just flavor. That's the memory of what pharmaceutical companies decided you didn't need to know. Today, malaria claims 610,000 people annually, 1,670 losses every single day. 75% of them are children under 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. Children bear the worst of it, and the natural compound that works sits abandoned. The pharmaceutical industry has zero financial incentive to revive natural quinine production. Patents on synthetic medications generate monopoly pricing. Natural compounds can't be patented. When chloroquine resistance emerged, they developed new synthetics rather than returning to quinine. Higher margins, better control. Each new medication buys another decade before resistance renders it useless. Each new medication generates billions during its brief window of efficacy. And quinine, the compound that never stopped working after 400 years, remains effectively suppressed through economic abandonment. Parts of Hawaii, the Appalachian Highlands, and Northern California fall within cinchona's temperature and elevation range. Small-scale cultivation is possible. The tree's requirements are demanding, but not impossible. What's missing isn't botanical potential. It's systematic suppression of the knowledge needed to make it economically viable on a distributed scale. That bitter taste in your glass is proof of this suppression. A reminder of medicine powerful enough to colonize continents, now diluted to 83 milligrams. Just enough for flavor, not enough to cure. The truth is sitting in plain sight, hidden behind every bar in the world. Parts of Hawaii, California, and the Appalachian Highlands could grow this tree tomorrow. The knowledge exists, the land exists, What's missing is people who know this story. Share this. Because the pharmaceutical industry spent 70 years making sure you forgot. And 600,000 people are passing away every year because it worked. Thanks for watching.